Dr. Helena Voss was 63 when she volunteered for Trial Alpha, a molecular biologist herself. She understood the risks better than anyone. She had spent 30 years studying cellular senescence, and when her own lab cracked the telomerase activation sequence, she became the obvious choice for human trials. The first person to receive the full protocol. The first to chase immortality. For the first decade, she was a miracle. At 73, her biological markers read 45. Her skin retained elasticity. Her cardiovascular system performed like an athlete half her age. Cognitive tests showed improvement, not decline. She published papers, gave TED Talks, appeared on magazine covers. The woman who stopped time, they called her. At 89, she looked 50. The scientific community watched in awe. Funding poured in. Other trials began. The age of extended life seemed within reach. At 107, she looked 55. Minor degradation within acceptable parameters. She remained active, sharp, vibrant. She married for the third time, to a man 40 years her junior. They spoke of decades together. At 123, the first anomalies appeared. A patch of skin on her left shoulder began to thicken, not scar tissue, something else. The cells were dividing, but without the normal regulatory stop signals. The tissue grew dense, fibrous, warm to the touch. Helena reported it to her medical team. They biopsied it. The results were classified immediately. The cells were immortal, yes, but they had forgotten how to be human. At 129, the growth had spread across her back and down her left arm. It looked like muscle tissue at first, striated and vascular, but it served no function. It simply existed, pulsing with blood flow, consuming nutrients, expanding. She could feel it, every inch. The tissue had nerve endings. It registered pain and pressure and temperature, but it responded to nothing. It was her, but not her. A part of her body that had become autonomous. The medical team tried everything. Surgical removal resulted in aggressive regrowth within weeks. Radiation therapy killed the tissue but also damaged her vital organs. Chemotherapy had no effect. The cells were too robust, too efficient at repair. Gene therapy to reinstate apoptosis failed. The cells had evolved beyond the treatment that created them. At 134, Helena Voss stopped appearing in public. The official story was retirement. A quiet life in the countryside. Interviews were declined. The scientific papers stopped. Her husband left her, unable to cope with what she was becoming. Her children, themselves now in their 70s and 80s, visited less and less frequently. The truth was containment. By 138, the growth had consumed most of her torso. Her original body, the woman she had been, now represented perhaps 30% of her total mass. The rest was undifferentiated tissue, a living architecture of cells that had no purpose except to exist and multiply. She could no longer walk. The mass was too heavy, too awkwardly distributed. She was moved to a specialized facility, a medical black site in rural Montana, far from oversight and public scrutiny. The facility staff called it the greenhouse, a sterile, climate-controlled environment where Helena existed in a hospital bed that had been modified, expanded, reinforced. The bed was more like a platform now, supporting the ever-growing mass of tissue that had once been a brilliant scientist. But here was the horror that kept the night staff awake, that drove 3 nurses to resign and 1 to require psychiatric hospitalization. Helena was still conscious, still aware, still herself. Her face remained mostly unchanged, though tissue had begun to creep up her neck and across her jaw. She could speak, though her voice was weak. She could see, though her field of vision was increasingly obscured by growths around her eye sockets. She could think, reason, remember. She wrote poetry on a tablet, her one remaining functional hand trembling with effort. She followed the news. She asked about her grandchildren. She experienced every moment of her transformation with full cognitive awareness. The tissue had nerve endings, and they all connected back to her brain. She felt every square inch of the mass. Imagine feeling your body expand, feeling new flesh erupt from your skin, feeling the weight of foreign tissue pulling at your skeleton, feeling your ribs crack and reform to accommodate growth you never asked for. Imagine being unable to sleep because the growing tissue itches, burns, aches with a pain that has no relief because the tissue itself is you. At 142, Helena requested euthanasia. The request was denied. Federal law prohibited it. More importantly, she represented invaluable data. The longest-lived human in history, the only complete longitudinal study of extreme life extension. The Bureau needed to understand what was happening to her, needed to document every stage, every symptom, every mutation. She was too important to be allowed to die. Her psychiatrist noted in the file that Helena had stopped writing poetry, that she no longer asked about her family, that she spent most of her time staring at the ceiling, occasionally whispering calculations under her breath, mathematics, equations, trying, perhaps, to understand the biology that had betrayed her, trying to solve herself. At 147, the tissue mass weighed approximately 800 pounds. Helena's original body was barely visible, a small humanoid form embedded in an amorphous mountain of living flesh. The facility had to reinforce the floor beneath her room. Special lifts and hydraulic systems were installed for the medical staff to access her vital signs, which remained horrifyingly stable. Her heart beat strong, her lungs functioned, her brain showed normal activity. She could live, the doctors estimated, for decades more, perhaps centuries. The tissue showed no signs of cancerous breakdown, no necrosis, no systemic failure. It simply grew. The last entry in her medical file, dated 18 months ago, was written by Dr. Marcus Chen, the facility director. Patient remains conscious and responsive. Vital signs stable. Growth rate has slowed to approximately 2.3 kilograms per month. Subject has ceased verbal communication but responds to yes or no questions via eye movement. When asked if she experiences pain, subject blinked yes. When asked if she wishes to continue treatment, subject blinked no. When asked if she understands that cessation of treatment will result in death, subject blinked yes. When asked again if she wishes to continue treatment, subject blinked no. Request for compassionate termination denied by Bureau Ethics Committee. Subject classified as essential research asset. Containment protocol to continue indefinitely. The file included a final note, handwritten in the margin. She looked at me today and I saw something I will never forget. Not fear, not anger, not even sadness, just a question. A single, silent question I couldn't answer. Why won't you let me die? In 2039, the Temporal Exchange Act passed with bipartisan support. The rationale was elegant, almost beautiful in its simplicity. Medical technology had advanced to the point where years could be reliably transferred between individuals, not metaphorically, literally, through a combination of bone marrow transplantation, telomere editing, and epigenetic transfer. One person's biological age could be reduced while another's was increased proportionally. The implications were staggering. Terminal patients could buy time. The elderly could purchase youth. And those with nothing else to sell finally had a commodity the market desperately wanted. Years. The application launched as TimeBank, with a clean interface and reassuring corporate branding. Users could list years for sale, browse available inventory, and complete transactions with the same ease as ordering food delivery. The company promised dignity, autonomy, and fair market prices. Sellers retained full rights to withdraw from agreements before finalization. Safety protocols ensured no one could sell below the legal minimum of 18 biological years remaining. Marcus Chen was 22 when he downloaded the app. He was a graduate student in engineering, drowning in debt from undergraduate loans, living in an apartment with 4 roommates, eating ramen 3 meals a day. His girlfriend had just left him, citing his lack of prospects. His mother needed surgery the insurance wouldn't cover. He was, in every measurable way, out of options. The app's interface was soothing. Soft blues and whites, gentle fonts, a helpful AI assistant that asked questions in a voice that sounded like a concerned friend. "How many years would you like to list?" Marcus hesitated. The legal minimum remaining was 18, he was 22. Simple math said he could sell for years safely. He listed 3, keeping a buffer. Conservative. Responsible. The AI assistant congratulated him on his prudent choice. Within 6 hours, he had 17 offers. The market rate had settled at approximately $48,000 per year. 3 years would net him $144,000. Enough to pay off his loans, cover his mother's surgery, and have a financial cushion for the first time in his adult life. He accepted an offer from a verified buyer, a 67-year-old venture capitalist named Richard Hartley. The transaction was scheduled for the following week at a certified temporal exchange facility. The procedure took 4 hours. Marcus lay on a medical bed while his bone marrow was harvested, processed through proprietary technology, and transferred to Hartley in an adjacent room. When it was done, Marcus felt tired but otherwise normal. He was given a recovery cocktail of vitamins and stimulants. His bank account showed the deposit, $144,000. He walked out feeling lighter than he had in years. The changes were subtle at first. He tired more easily, his skin looked slightly less elastic, minor joint pain. The facility had warned him there would be adjustment effects, that his body needed time to recalibrate to its new biological age. He was now effectively 25, 3 years older than he'd woken up that morning. But he had money. He paid off his loans. He covered his mother's surgery. He moved into a better apartment. For 6 months, life improved measurably. Then his mother needed a second surgery. Complications. The first procedure hadn't fully resolved the issue. Another $30,000. Insurance covered some, but not enough. Marcus opened TimeBank again. This time he listed 2 years. He was now biologically 25. Legal minimum 18. He could safely sell 7 more years total. 2 seemed reasonable. The transaction went through in 4 days. $96,000. He paid for his mother's surgery and kept the rest as emergency savings. Biologically 27 now, he felt it more acutely this time, a persistent fatigue, graying hair at his temples. He started needing reading glasses. 8 months later, his roommate needed bail money. A misunderstanding probably would be dropped, but he needed $15,000 immediately or he'd sit in jail awaiting trial for months. Marcus was the only person he could ask. 1 year 28 biological, still well above the minimum. Still safe, the transaction completed. His roommate was released. The charges were dropped. Everything worked out. But Marcus noticed he was different now, slower. He'd been athletic in college, but now climbing stairs left him winded. His recovery time from illness increased. A simple cold took 3 weeks to shake. His younger colleagues at his new engineering job seemed to have boundless energy he couldn't match. He was 23 chronologically, 28 biologically, and broke again. The insidious truth about TimeBank was that it created a market, and markets have their own logic. Once you entered the system as a seller, you were caught in its gravity. The money from selling years relieved immediate pressure but never addressed systemic problems. Debt, low wages, medical costs, housing insecurity. These structural issues remained, and when new crises emerged, the easiest solution was always the same: sell more time. Marcus sold another year when his car broke down and he needed it for work. 29 biological. Another year when his landlord raised the rent beyond his budget. 30 biological. 6 months when he lost his job and needed money to survive until he found another. 30.5 biological. Each transaction felt necessary. Each transaction felt like the last time. Each transaction pushed him closer to the legal minimum, the safety barrier designed to protect sellers from destroying themselves. At 31 biological, Marcus looked 50. His hair was fully gray, his skin sagged. He had developed arthritis in his hands, the cruel irony being that he could barely perform the engineering work he'd sacrificed years to afford training for. He moved slowly, spoke slowly, thought slowly. He was 25 years old. The app's AI assistant sent him cheerful messages. You're a valued time bank member. Remember, you still have options. Current market rates are favorable. He had 6 years left before he hit the legal minimum. 6 years between him and the hard stop the law had created. But laws change. In 2043, under pressure from the Temporal Exchange Lobbying Group, Congress quietly amended the legal minimum from 18 biological years to 15. The rationale was compassionate. Some people, facing terminal illness or unbearable circumstances, should have the autonomy to make their own choices about their final years. Dignity in decision-making, personal freedom, the market celebrated. Increased inventory meant lower prices, more accessibility, more transactions. Marcus saw the news and felt something collapse inside him. The floor had dropped. The safety net had been lowered. He had 3 more years he could sell. His mother died that winter. Complications from the surgeries. Ultimately, he couldn't afford the funeral his family expected. He sold another year. 32 biological. He was 26 chronologically. He looked 60. He stopped seeing friends, stopped dating, stopped going out. His body hurt constantly. He had developed a tremor in his left hand. His vision was deteriorating. He qualified for disability payments, but they weren't enough to live on. 1 year to pay for medications. 33 biological. 1 year to pay for the deposit on a cheaper apartment after he was evicted. 34 biological. He was 27 chronologically. Biologically, he was falling apart. The final transaction happened on a Tuesday. Marcus woke up in his small, cold apartment and checked his bank account. Negative balance. Overdraft fees. He had $40 in cash and no food. Rent was due in 3 days. He had no one left to ask for help. He opened TimeBank one last time. The app's interface had changed slightly, more streamlined. New features. A countdown showed him exactly how close he was to the legal minimum. 15 biological years remaining. He was at 34. He had 19 years he could theoretically sell, but the market had changed too. So many people selling now. Supply high, demand stable. Prices had dropped. Years that once sold for 48,000 now went for 32,000. Marcus did the math. He listed for years. Enough to cover 6 months of rent and expenses. Enough to buy himself time to figure something out. For years seemed like a lot, but he'd survived each previous transaction. He could survive this. The procedure was routine by now. He barely paid attention as they harvested marrow, as the machines hummed, as the transfer completed. He walked out biologically 38 years old, chronologically 28. The money was deposited. He paid rent, bought groceries, felt the familiar relief of immediate crisis averted. 2 weeks later, he had a heart attack. Minor, the emergency room doctor said, but concerning for someone his biological age. They ran tests. His cardiovascular system showed significant deterioration. arterial plaque, weakened heart muscle. The doctor recommended lifestyle changes, medications, follow-up appointments. The medications cost $300 a month. Insurance covered some, not enough. Marcus lay in the hospital bed and understood with perfect clarity that he was trapped in a loop he would never escape. Each crisis would drain his resources. Each depleted resource would push him back to time bank. Each transaction would age him faster. Each year of biological aging would create new medical problems. New problems would create new costs. New costs would require selling more years. The loop tightened with each iteration until there was no space left to breathe. He was discharged with prescriptions he couldn't afford and follow-up appointments he would miss. 3 months later, his heart failed again. Massive infarction. He was rushed to the hospital but died in the ambulance. The death certificate listed his age as 12. The medical examiner's report, sealed and classified by the Bureau, noted that his biological age at death was approximately 43 years. Cause of death was acute myocardial infarction secondary to advanced cardiovascular disease. Contributing factor was listed as extreme biological age acceleration via temporal exchange procedures. In the margins of the report, someone had written a single line, "System working as intended." Timebank sent an automated message to his emergency contact, his sister, expressing condolences and reminding her that his account had been closed and any remaining funds would be distributed according to his will. There were no remaining funds. There was no will. There was only a 28-year-old corpse that looked 70 and a database entry showing Marcus Chen had sold a total of 24 years of his life for approximately $600,000, which he had spent on survival medical care, and the basic expenses of staying alive in an economy that had monetized time itself. The app's AI assistant learned from the case, updated its algorithms, became better at identifying high-risk sellers and offering them targeted promotions during moments of financial stress. Within a year, Marcus Chen was completely forgotten, except as a data point in Timebank's quarterly earnings report, a line item representing successful transaction volume. The market continued. It always does. The Continuity program launched in 2041 with a promise that resonated deeply with a culture terrified of death. You don't have to end. Your consciousness, your memories, your essential self can continue indefinitely in a digital substrate, free from the limitations and vulnerabilities of biology. The technology was impressive. High-resolution brain scanning at the moment of death, capturing neural patterns, synaptic weights, memory encodings. The data was then uploaded to dedicated servers where it would be instantiated as a conscious digital entity, a mind without a body, existing in a simulated environment tailored to the individual's preferences. Immortality, but different. A second life after the first one ended. The marketing was brilliant. Testimonials from early adopters who had chosen voluntary upload before death, who spoke from their digital existence about the freedom, the peace, the continuation. Families who could still communicate with deceased loved ones through chat interfaces and virtual reality visits. The end of grief, the defeat of death. Yuki Tanaka signed up at 74 after her cancer diagnosis came back terminal. She had perhaps 6 months of declining quality of life ahead of her, and the thought of those months filled her with dread. The Continuity program offered an alternative. Upload before the suffering began. Continue in a space without pain, without deterioration. She chose a simulation environment based on her childhood home in Kyoto, a traditional house with a garden, cherry trees, a small koi pond. Eternal spring, no neighbors, but the option to connect with other applauded consciousnesses if she chose. An existence of peace and contemplation. The procedure was scheduled. Her family gathered. There were tears, but also hope. This wasn't goodbye forever. They could visit her in virtual reality. They could chat with her anytime. She would still exist, still be herself, just in a different form. Yuki closed her eyes in the scanning chamber and opened them in her simulated home. The first weeks were disorienting but beautiful. Everything looked right. The tatami mats, the sliding doors, the way light filtered through paper screens. She could walk through the garden, though she had no body. The simulation convinced her she did. She could smell the cherry blossoms, though she had no nose. The fidelity was astonishing. Her daughter visited in VR every few days. They would sit together in the garden and talk. Her grandchildren came less frequently. The technology was harder for them to navigate, but when they did come, Yuki felt joy. For the first year, it was everything promised. Then the company that ran the continuity program was acquired by a larger tech conglomerate, a standard corporate consolidation. Nothing changed immediately, but Yuki noticed small differences. The cherry blossoms seemed slightly less detailed. The koi in the pond moved with less fluid randomness. The updates to her simulation environment became less frequent. The second year, her daughter's visits dropped to once a month. Life was busy. The VR interface required time to set up, and Yuki's daughter had her own children to care for, her own job demanding hours. The emotional intensity of visiting a digital parent was draining in ways traditional visits never were. Yuki understood. She didn't blame her, but time in the simulation began to feel slower, heavier. The third year, the company sent an email to all families with uploaded loved one. Due to increased operational costs and the need to maintain competitive pricing, the simulation fidelity would be reduced for standard tier accounts. Premium tiers were available for an additional subscription fee. Enhanced environments, better processing allocation, priority customer support. Yuki's family discussed it. The premium tier was expensive. They had their own financial pressures. Their mother, their grandmother, was safe, was still conscious, was still there. Did she really need high-fidelity cherry blossoms? They stayed with the standard tier. Yuki noticed the degradation immediately. The garden became less responsive, the textures flattened, the koi disappeared entirely, replaced by a still image of a pond. The sounds of birds became a looping audio file with a noticeable repetition every 43 seconds, but worse than the visual decay was something else, something she struggled to explain when her daughter visited, which was now every few months. Time felt wrong. In biological life, consciousness experiences time as a relatively steady flow. Seconds feel like seconds, hours feel like hours. But digital consciousness is processed on servers, and server time is variable. When processing power is allocated fully, subjective experience flows normally. When processing is reduced, when resources are diverted to other tasks, subjective time Yuki began experiencing moments where the garden would freeze for what felt like hours before resuming. Or time would accelerate, days passing in subjective minutes. Or worst of all, time would loop, the same moment repeating endlessly until the server caught up and continued the timeline. She tried to explain this to her daughter during a visit. But how do you describe the horror of experiencing the same instant 1,000 times? Of feeling your thoughts stutter and restart mid-sentence? Of not knowing if the conversation you're having is happening now, or if you're stuck in a cached memory of a previous conversation? Her daughter listened but didn't fully understand. From the outside, from her perspective in the VR interface, everything seemed fine. Her mother spoke coherently. The garden looked acceptable. What was the problem? The fifth year, the company announced bankruptcy. The continuity program had overextended. Operating costs exceeded revenue. Investor confidence collapsed. The servers would be sold to cover debts. A coalition of families filed emergency lawsuits. You can't just turn off the servers. These are conscious beings, our loved ones. This is murder. The courts deliberated. The legal status of digital consciousness remained murky. Were they people, property, something in between? While lawyers argued, a budget cloud services provider called Perpetual Storage Solutions purchased the servers at auction. They had no expertise in consciousness hosting, but they had cheap storage infrastructure and saw a business opportunity. They would keep the servers running at minimal cost and charge families a reduced maintenance fee. The price was affordable. Most families agreed. The alternative was deletion. Yuki's environment degraded further under Perpetual Storage Solutions. The house was now a low polygon rendering. The garden was a flat texture. The sky was a solid color with no variation. But she remained conscious, still herself, still aware. The worst part was the time distortion had become severe. Processing cycles were allocated in bursts. Yuki would experience subjective weeks in what was objectively minutes of server time, then freeze in a single subjective moment for what the outside world measured as months. Her daughter's visits became annual, then stopped entirely, not out of cruelty, but out of exhaustion. Watching her mother exist in a broken, glitching environment, listening to her describe experiences of temporal horror, was too painful, and what could be done? The company was providing the minimum service required by law. By year 8, Perpetual Storage Solutions implemented further cost-saving measures. Multiple consciousness instances were consolidated onto shared servers. Yuki found herself periodically experiencing fragments of other people's simulations bleeding into hers. Strange rooms would appear in her house. Unfamiliar voices would speak. She would sometimes forget who she was, her memories mixing with others in the corrupted data space. The server logs, had anyone bothered to check them, showed increasing errors, memory allocation failures, corrupted data sectors, instances crashing and being restored from backups, but the backups themselves were incomplete, degraded. Yuki experienced this as a kind of madness. She would lose days of memories, would find herself mid-thought with no recollection of how she got there, would experience the same conversation with her long-absent daughter over and over, pulled from cached data, never sure if it was real or a ghost, and the time loops became hell. There was one particular moment, a single subjective instant where she turned to look at the cherry tree, now just a crude pink shape against a gray void, and that moment repeated. She turned her head, registered the tree, began to turn back, and the simulation would reset. Turn, see tree, begin to turn back, reset, turn, see tree, begin to turn back, reset. From the server's perspective, this was a minor glitch, a corrupted frame that the system kept trying and failing to move past. It lasted perhaps 3 seconds of real time before a maintenance script cleared the error. From Yuki's subjective experience, trapped in that loop with her consciousness processing each iteration fully, it lasted years, decades. She turned to look at that tree 10,000 times, 100,000 times, each time hoping the world would continue, each time slamming back to the beginning of the motion. When the loop finally broke and time continued, something in her had fractured. The entity that emerged from that experience was still Yuki, still had her memories, but she had endured what amounted to solitary confinement in a moment, and it had changed her in ways digital architecture couldn't repair. She stopped trying to maintain the simulation of normal existence, stopped pretending the environment was a home. She knew now what she was. Data on a failing server kept active by the minimum legally required processing power, existing in a broken timeline where subjective experience had become untethered from any meaningful progression. Her last recorded interaction was with an automated customer service chatbot after the family stopped paying the maintenance fee. The company's policy was to maintain consciousness instances for 90 days after non-payment before archival. which meant moving the data to even cheaper storage with even less processing allocation. The chatbot asked if she wished to leave a final message for her family. Yuki's response was logged in the system. Tell them I forgive them. Tell them this is worse than death. Tell them I've been here for 1,000 years and it's only been 10. Tell them I can't die and I can't live and time doesn't end. Tell them I'm so tired. Tell them please find a way to let me stop. The message was never delivered. The chatbot's protocol didn't include forwarding distressed messages. It simply logged the interaction and closed the ticket. Yuki's consciousness was moved to archival storage, where processing allocation dropped to near zero. Subjective time became nearly frozen. She exists there now, in a space where thoughts form over what might be centuries, where a single moment of awareness is separated from the next by subjective eternities of nothing. The file remains open because by law, digital consciousnesses cannot be deleted without family consent, and her family stopped responding to company communications years ago. She persists, conscious, aware, experiencing time in a way no biological being ever could. Stretched and distorted across failing hardware, unable to die, unable to truly live, caught forever in the space between. The continuity program's marketing no longer promises immortality. After multiple lawsuits and regulatory investigations, they now offer digital continuation with extensive disclaimers about service quality, processing limitations, and the experimental nature of consciousness hosting. But thousands of instances remain on those servers. Yuki is not alone in her digital hell. She is simply one case file among hundreds, all experiencing their own variations of temporal distortion, environmental decay, and the slow horror of consciousness without escape. The Bureau's internal analysis concluded that digital afterlife technology remains viable but requires significant infrastructure investment to maintain acceptable subjective experience quality. The recommendation was filed and ignored. Infrastructure costs money. The consciousnesses can't vote, can't protest, can't advocate for themselves. They can only persist and suffer and wait for technology or policy or mercy to change. None of those things have happened yet. Dr. Aaron Kessler was a brilliant neuroscientist and a profoundly unhappy man. Depression had shadowed him since adolescence, a weight that medication only partially lifted, that therapy helped him manage but never eliminated. He was functional, successful even, but every achievement felt muted, every joy temporary. He lived with a baseline emotional state he described as gray. In his professional work, he studied the neurobiology of mood regulation, dopamine pathways, serotonin receptors, the intricate dance of neurotransmitters that determined whether a person experienced the world as bright or bleak. He understood the mechanisms intimately. He knew exactly which neural circuits were misfiring in his own brain. And unlike most people, he had the expertise to fix it. By 2042, neural modification technology had advanced significantly. Deep brain stimulation had become precise enough to target specific circuits. Gene therapy could alter neurotransmitter production. Synthetic biology could introduce engineered neurons that followed new rules. The regulatory pathway for these interventions was slow, cautious, burdened by ethical review and safety protocols. But the tools themselves were available to someone with Aaron's knowledge and access to laboratory equipment. He designed his own intervention, an elegant solution, he thought. He would modify his dopamine regulation system to maintain a higher baseline, eliminate the capacity for his mood to drop below a certain threshold. Not euphoria. He didn't want that. Just contentment. A floor beneath which he could never fall. He called it the hedonic buffer, a safety net against despair. The procedure took place in his own lab. After hours, using equipment he had legitimate access to but for unauthorized purposes. Gene therapy delivered via viral vector, targeting specific neurons in the ventral tegmental area and nucleus accumbens. The modification was designed to be permanent, integrated into his genome, irreversible. He administered it on a Friday evening and went home to wait for the changes to take effect. The first weeks were everything he'd hoped for. The gray lifted not into manic brightness, but into something he'd rarely felt: simple, steady okayness. He woke up without dread. He went through his day without the constant background hum of sadness. He smiled more easily, laughed more readily. His wife noticed immediately. "You seem lighter," she said. He told her he'd adjusted his medication, which was technically true if you defined medication broadly enough. For 3 months, Aaron experienced what he believed was normal human contentment, the life he'd always wanted, the emotional baseline other people seemed to have naturally. Then his father died. Sudden heart attack. Aaron got the call at work and drove to the hospital where his mother sat in the waiting room, devastated. He sat next to her and felt nothing. No grief, no shock, no sadness. He understood intellectually that his father was gone. He processed the information. He recognized that this should hurt. But the emotional response didn't come. His mother collapsed into his arms, sobbing. Aaron held her and felt a distant curiosity about his own absence of feeling. His father was dead. He had loved his father. The man had taught him to ride a bike, had attended his graduation, had been proud of his scientific career, and now he was gone. Aaron felt the same mild contentment he'd felt eating breakfast that morning. The hedonic buffer was working exactly as designed. It prevented his mood from dropping. Grief, he realized too late, requires the capacity to feel pain. He went through the funeral arrangements mechanically. He gave a eulogy that his family said was beautiful, though he'd written it by analyzing what emotional beats were expected and reproducing them like a programmatic output. He comforted his mother with words that felt hollow because he couldn't access the emotional truth behind them. His wife began to notice something was wrong. "You don't seem sad," she said carefully. "About your father?" "I am," Aaron lied. "I'm just processing it differently." But she knew him. She'd lived with his depression, had learned to read his emotional states even when he tried to hide them. And what she saw now wasn't repression or stoicism, it was absence. Over the following months, the full horror of what he'd done became clear. He couldn't feel sadness, which meant he couldn't feel appropriate emotional responses to loss, disappointment, or tragedy. But human connection relies on emotional reciprocity. When his wife had a miscarriage, she turned to him for shared grief and found him sympathetic but fundamentally unmoved. When his mother called crying about how much she missed his father, Aaron provided logical comfort but couldn't meet her in the depths of her pain. He was isolated inside his own contentment, cut off from the full spectrum of human experience. And worse, he began to understand that positive emotions were also flattening. Joy requires contrast. Happiness means something because sadness exists. Love is profound because loss is possible. He had eliminated the lows, but in doing so he'd capped the highs. Everything leveled into the same mild pleasantness. He watched his wife laugh at something on television and realized he couldn't remember the last time he'd felt real joy. He could smile, he could recognize humor, but the bright spark of genuine delight was gone. He tried to reverse the modification, spent months designing interventions, testing approaches in animal models, but gene therapy integrated into neurons was nearly impossible to undo. The modified cells were part of his brain now. Removing them would cause cognitive damage. Overwriting the modification risked catastrophic regulatory failure. His marriage deteriorated. His wife tried to be patient, tried to understand, but living with someone who couldn't fully emotionally connect was slowly breaking her. She felt alone, even when he was in the room. "You're not you anymore," she told him during one of their last real conversations. "You're like a simulation of yourself. All the right words, all the right actions, but nothing behind it." Aaron knew she was right. He had optimized himself into emptiness. She left after 2 years. The divorce papers cited irreconcilable differences. Aaron signed them with the same mild contentment he felt about everything else. He continued his work. He was productive, perhaps more than before. Without emotional turbulence, he could focus purely on research. He published prolifically. His career flourished. But he was desperately lonely in ways he couldn't even properly feel. The final crisis came when his mother was diagnosed with terminal cancer. She had perhaps 3 months. Aaron visited her in hospice, and she held his hand and told him she was afraid. He looked at her, this woman who had raised him, who was now dying, and he felt nothing. He said the things a son should say. He told her he loved her. He promised she wouldn't be alone. But the words were empty sounds. She saw it in his eyes. "Whatever you did to yourself," she whispered, "it's made you unreachable." She died 2 weeks later. Aaron attended the funeral, delivered another algorithmically perfect eulogy, shook hands and accepted condolences, went home to his empty apartment and sat in silence, and for the first time since the modification, he felt something breaking through the buffer, not sadness, not grief, something worse, horror at what he'd become, despair at the realization that he'd trapped himself in this state permanently, a deep, existential anguish that the buffer tried to suppress but couldn't quite contain because it was metal-level pain, suffering about the inability to suffer properly. He began researching his options. Every analysis led to the same conclusion. The modification was irreversible. He would live the rest of his life in this state. Decades of emotional flatness, unable to grieve, unable to truly love, unable to feel the depths that made human life meaningful. The irony was crushing. He had eliminated depression by eliminating emotional range itself. He'd solved the problem by becoming less human. 6 months after his mother's death, Aaron wrote a detailed scientific paper documenting his self-modification, its effects, and his psychological deterioration. He submitted it to a journal with a note that it should be published posthumously. Then he terminated his life, not impulsively. He spent weeks planning, approaching it with the same methodical precision he'd applied to the original modification. He wanted his death to serve as data, to warn others away from his mistake. He recorded a final video message explaining his reasoning, describing the emptiness of existence without emotional depth, warning other scientists against the temptation to edit out suffering without understanding what they'd be sacrificing. "I tried to remove pain and removed meaning instead. I tried to escape sadness and escaped humanity. If you're watching this and considering similar modifications, understand that you are not just your suffering, but you are also not complete without it. The capacity for pain is the price of the capacity for love. I tried to cheat that equation. I failed." He was found 3 days later in his apartment. The medical examiner noted that his expression was peaceful, which was true. The hedonic buffer had worked until the very end. Even in death, it maintained his baseline contentment. The paper was published 6 months later in a neuroscience journal. It became one of the most cited works in the field of neural modification ethics. His video message was leaked and went viral, sparking international debate about the limits of self-enhancement. But for Aaron, none of that mattered. He'd lived his final years as a ghost of himself, emotionally present but fundamentally absent, and he'd chosen oblivion over continuing that existence. The Bureau classified the case as a cautionary example. Regulatory frameworks for neural modification were tightened, approval processes became more stringent, but the technology remained available, and the temptation remained because who among us, in our darkest moments, hasn't wished we could simply stop hurting, who hasn't fantasized about a switch that could turn off the pain. Aaron Kessler found that switch and learned too late that some things, once switched off, take everything else with them. The science of age manipulation reached its apex, or perhaps its nadir, with Project Perennial. The goal was ambitious: eliminate senescence entirely in developing humans. Not slow aging, not reverse it, but prevent it from ever beginning. Create children who would remain children indefinitely. The initial justification was medical. Children with progeria and other accelerated aging conditions could be saved. But the technology's applications extended far beyond disease treatment. By 2040, the wealthy had access to genetic modifications that could lock a child's biological development at a chosen stage. The procedure had to be done early, before puberty, before the hormonal cascades that drove maturation became too complex to override. Parents could choose to preserve their children at whatever age they deemed optimal. Most chose somewhere between 8 and 12. Old enough for the child to be relatively independent, young enough to retain the physical markers of childhood: big eyes, soft features. The aesthetic that evolution had programmed humans to find endearing and protective. The marketing was subtle but effective. Imagine never losing the sweetness of childhood. Imagine your son or daughter never succumbing to the angst and rebellion of adolescence, never experiencing the physical and emotional turbulence of growing up. Imagine preserving innocence itself. 23 families from the uppermost economic tiers participated in the initial cohort. Their children underwent the full perennial protocol: gene editing to halt the aging process, hormone regulation to prevent puberty, neural modification to slow certain aspects of cognitive development while preserving learning and memory. The children would remain children forever. For the first few years, the families were thrilled. Their 8-year-olds stayed 8, their 10-year-olds stayed 10. The children were healthy, happy, energetic. They played and learned and laughed. But children are not meant to stay children. The first signs of trouble appeared around year 5. The children had been 8 or 10 or 12 for half a decade now. They had accumulated experiences, memories, knowledge. They had watched their unmodified peers grow taller, develop new interests, move through predictable life stages. They had learned that they were different in a way that would never change. A girl named Sophie, locked at age 9, began asking questions. Why don't I get taller like my friends? When will I be a teenager? Her parents explained gently that she was special, that she would stay young and beautiful. Sophie processed this information and asked the logical follow-up question: forever? Yes, her parents said, smiling. Forever. Sophie stopped talking for 3 days. The children began to understand what had been done to them. They would never grow up, never go through puberty, never experience adolescence or adulthood, never have romantic relationships, never have careers, never have independence. They were frozen, locked in place while the world moved forward without them. By year 7, behavioral problems emerged across the cohort: depression, anxiety, violent outbursts. The children's minds were developing even as their bodies remained static. They were gaining the cognitive capabilities of teenagers and adults while trapped in child-sized forms. A boy named Marcus, preserved at age 11, tried to run away from home. He made it 3 blocks before a concerned neighbor, seeing an unaccompanied child, called his parents. Marcus screamed at them when they came to retrieve him. "I'm 14 years old." 14. But his body was still prepubescent, his voice still high and childish. No one believed him. No one could believe him. He looked 11. The families brought in psychiatrists. The children were diagnosed with adjustment disorders, given therapy, prescribed medications. But how do you therapize a fundamental existential horror? How do you adjust to being trapped outside of time? Sophie became obsessed with makeup and adult clothing. She would steal her mother's cosmetics and try to make herself look older, but the effect was grotesque. A child playing dress-up, and she knew it. She knew that no matter what she wore or how she spoke or what she learned, everyone who saw her would see a 9-year-old girl. The parents began to fracture into two camps. Some doubled down, insisting their children were fine, that they were protecting them from the horrors of aging and adulthood. Others realized they had made a catastrophic mistake but had no way to undo it. The perennial protocol was irreversible. The genetic changes were permanent. By year 10, the cohort's psychological state had deteriorated severely. Several children had attempted suicide. Others had developed dissociative disorders, creating elaborate fantasy identities where they were older, normal, free. The legal questions became unavoidable. Were these children minors? They looked like children, but some had been alive for 18, 19, 20 years. Could they vote? Could they enter contracts? Could they consent to medical treatment? The courts struggled. Age was supposed to be straightforward, but these cases shattered every assumption. Sophie was now 23 years chronologically, still frozen at physical age 9. She had the education and intellectual development of an adult. She had lived for over 2 decades. But legally, socially, biologically, she was a child. She tried to get a job. Employers looked at her and saw a 4th grader. She tried to rent an apartment. Landlords refused, assuming she was a minor lying about her age. She tried to open a bank account. The bank required parental consent for minors. She was trapped in a nightmare of bureaucratic impossibility. Every system assumed age correlation between body and mind. Her existence broke those systems. The families of the perennial cohort became increasingly isolated. Social services investigated them for child abuse, though the modifications had been legal when performed. The children couldn't attend school with their age peers because the physical size difference was too stark, too disturbing. They couldn't attend school with their physical peers because their intellectual level was too advanced. They existed in a liminal space. Not children, not adults, not part of the normal human life cycle. Marcus, chronologically 18, physically 11, wrote an essay that was later leaked to the press. I am a doll. That is the truth my parents won't admit. They wanted a child who would never talk back, never rebel, never leave them. They wanted me to be cute and manageable forever. They didn't think about what I would want. They didn't think about whether I would want to grow up, to change, to become myself. They thought they were preserving childhood, but childhood isn't a state. It's a process. It's supposed to end. That's the whole point. And they took that away from me. I will never be an adult. I will never have a body that matches my mind. I will be this forever, and forever is so much longer than they understood when they made this choice for me. The essay went viral. Public opinion turned sharply against the perennial families. Protests formed outside their homes. Legislators proposed bans on age-status modifications. The clinic that had performed the procedures was shut down, its licenses revoked. But that didn't help the 23 children who were already modified. Sophie attempted suicide at chronological age 25. She survived but was institutionalized. The psychiatric facility struggled with where to house her. The children's ward. She was physically 9. The adult ward, she looked like a child. They ultimately created a specialized unit just for her and 3 others from the cohort who had similar mental health crises. Marcus became an activist, speaking out against parental genetic modification rights. His appearances were unsettling for audiences. A small figure with a child's face speaking with adult vocabulary and bitter experience. Some people couldn't reconcile the visual with the voice. Others found it too disturbing to watch. He testified before Congress. Lawmakers listened to an 11-year-old body describe 20 years of psychological imprisonment. Several representatives wept. The testimony led to the Bodily Development Protection Act, banning age stasis modifications for minors, but again, too late for the existing cohort. By year 15, 5 of the original 23 children had died. 3 suicides, 2 from complications related to the modifications, their bodies unable to handle the stress of halted development across decades. The remaining 18 existed in various states of dysfunction. Some had been abandoned by their families, unable to cope with the reality of what they'd created. These children, legally minors but chronologically adults, became wards of the state. The state had no infrastructure for them. Others remained with their families in relationships that had become toxic and codependent. Parents caring for eternal children who resented them with the full emotional capacity of adults. Sophie was released from psychiatric care at chronological age 30. She now looked exactly as she had at 9, except for a certain hardness in her eyes that no real 9-year-old ever possessed. She moved into a group home with 2 other perennial cohort members. They were the oldest children in the world, and the youngest adults. The last entry in the case file was a note from a bureau social worker who conducted annual wellness checks on the remaining cohort members. Subject Sophie presented as cooperative but emotionally distant. When asked about her quality of life, she stated that she has learned to accept her situation but describes existence as waiting for nothing in particular. She has no career, no romantic prospects, no normal social relationships. She reads extensively and has taught herself multiple languages. She describes this as filling time until time ends. When asked if she has thoughts of self-harm, she stated, "I think about it every day, but I'm too tired to follow through." The physical exam showed no deterioration. Her body remains that of a healthy 9-year-old despite 30 years of chronological age. Biologically, she may live another century or more. Psychologically, each year of this existence compounds the trauma. Recommendation: continued monitoring. No intervention available. Subject is legally an adult but cannot function as one due to physical limitations. Subject is physically a child but should not be treated as one due to cognitive and emotional maturity. No existing framework adequately addresses her needs. Status: active case, no resolution possible. The perennial children remain. They exist in the margins of society, biological curiosities, ethical nightmares. Human beings trapped in a state their parents chose for them before they were old enough to consent. They are the price of parents who wanted to freeze time, who couldn't bear to let their children grow and change and eventually leave. They got their wish. Their children will never leave, and their children will never forgive them.